Well, welcome to Moral Side of the News, our weekly discussion of today's top stories from a moral, ethical, and religious point of view. I'm Shawn Kaelin with the WHAS Crusade for Children, and I'm joined today, as always, by a distinguished panel of local religious leaders. Reverend Clay Calloway, West Louisville Ministers Coalition, Father John Stoltz, St. Aloysius Catholic Church, Rabbi Stan Miles, Louisville Melton School, Reverend Dr. George Wasson, Faithpoint Church, and Richard Uhler, retired U.S. Army chaplain. We begin this week with the mass layoffs this past Tuesday at the U.S. Department of Education.
Overnight, the Department of Education gutted. More than 1,300 workers told they're being laid off, now cutting the agency roughly in half. Education Secretary Linda McMahon saying those cuts are just the first step.
What we did today was to take the first step of eliminating what I think is bureaucratic bloat.
The department is already the smallest of all cabinet-level agencies, but is responsible for everything from managing federal loans for colleges to enforcing civil rights laws in schools. The leader of the nation's largest teachers union says students will pay the price.
There is no way that that's going to lead to faster service. Calls will go unlistened to, emails will go unread. We know that.
McMahon asks what will happen to some of the department's critical programs, like Pell Grants and funding for students from low-income families.
We kept all of the right people and the good people to make sure that the outward-facing programs, the grants, the appropriations that come from Congress, all of that are being met, and none of that's going to fall through the cracks.
McMahon says the president has given her a mandate to strip down the agency and work with Congress to eliminate it.
So panel, we come out to you. How do you evaluate the layoffs at the U.S. Department of Education, and what moral responsibilities do government leaders have in balancing fiscal responsibility and the well-being of federal employees with the future of education and the broader societal impacts of these decisions?
You know, it's really, really ironic. We've been sitting here for about 10 minutes before the show started, and I get the news on my Apple Watch, which is a bit bizarre. And one of the things that came across my watch as I was waiting for the program is that there was a massive reinstatement of people who were laid off. Now, you're dealing with a watch here. I don't know what department got rehired, but somebody did. And I think the whole issue is the massive unknown of what's going to happen next with our country, with our government. You look at it and you see it reflected in the financial community, and it's frightening. It's just hard to answer what's going to happen next. Where are we going from here? It's the great unknown, but it's not so great.
You know, it's just what you're seeing taking place is just clearly an upheaval, for lack of a better term. It's confusion, and that's being kind. What's happening in the last 2 months of the new administration has been a very massive, chaotic episode that's swept the country like a plague. And this is the latest episode with the Department of Education. The mass cuts, which sounds like mass killings, but it's still mass mayhem that's been launched in a department that is critical to this country's future. Education is a passport to the future. So it appears to be, as I was informed by my colleague who is an education expert, it appears to be the latest episode of trying to cut public education, weaken public education, to make it more exposed to the possibility of private acquisition and management. So this is what's happening in an era where information and education is so vital. The Bible says my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And then here you have a decision that was made by this administration that has lacked wisdom in so many ways to cut education at a time when education is so desperately needed in this nation. It just weakens this nation, and it's a very scary episode of this current administration doing mayhem and creating chaos in the country with these massive cuts.
I think one of the challenges that we face is that when we talk about wisdom and knowledge, I agree with you what you said from scriptures, but even as ministry leaders, we have very limited information. You know, when we look at the Department of Education and we say, oh, all this education is going to be cut kind of deal, you know, more than 50% of the population voted for President Trump, both from an electoral college as well as a popular vote perspective. And one of the things President Trump said when he was running was that he was going to make some drastic changes to the Department of Education, because we know that it is one of the most bloated with administrative folks of the different agencies. You know, when we look at what the Department of Education has done from coming into its beginning in 1980, the United States has gone from being in the top 10 of education in math, reading, and science in the world to number 40. And what we've seen is an 80% increase plus in administrative overhead, and about an 8% increase in teachers, and about an 8% increase in students. So I appreciate what the new secretary said, is that they are looking at places, they're going to keep the programs, they're going to keep the things that are beneficial, but to look at the bloat and just the excess that has been created. Are they hard decisions? Yes, they are. But I just want us to be careful of making decisions and criticisms of some of the things that we see happening when we really are working with very limited information. We don't know everything that's gone into the decisions, but what we can know is we can look at the data and we can say, okay, as ministry leaders, we're supposed to be wise stewards of the resources that are placed into our care. $35 million in debt right now, bloated administrations, money's being spent on places that are not really what they're intended to be for. Only about $40 million of the $250 million of the Department of Education goes to primary and secondary education. There's a huge amount of that cost is in administrative overhead that I want to take what the secretary said at her word, that that's going to be one of the first places that they're going to look at to make some cuts.
But I don't want to take her at her word, and here's
I
the
agree
reason.
with you.
And here's the reason why: is that any kind of choices like this, and there have been other choices in this way, I think needs some transparency with the American public. Yes, the current administration was voted in, but in terms of this decision, there needs to be reasons why these cuts were made. And the other thing around this is that when systems have problems, and every system needs improvement, it seems to me that a good way to go is that you do some study on it, you make that study transparent. The public then is offered feedback through their congressional representatives, their senators, and you look at improving a system in a way that is thoughtful, that has taken some research. Here we're seeing a number of different issues where cuts are just being made. These decisions seem to me, especially being offered, where I don't see too many reasons for them other than bloat. And I think that bloat needs to be cut. And efficiency is a good thing in government and in all systems. So I think all of that's fine and good. But it requires some study and some work and some thoughtfulness to say, what exactly in this system is not working and what is? What could be a better value and what is not of good value right now? And I think that those decisions can be made, but they do require work. And here, I think, just cutting something that bloat and doing it very quickly, not offering reason, is not actually doing a whole lot of work. It's actually being irresponsible.
Well, it's a lazy way of doing it.
But isn't that really us making the assumption that none of the work has been done? Maybe there's been a lot of work done over the last 4 years prior to President Trump coming into office, and looking at and examining the data and figuring out what's going on and trying to figure out the places that we can actually cut and get our $35 trillion bad stewardship under control. So there's a perspective that's going to say, well, they're just doing this haphazardly and pulling things and cutting. I don't think that's true. My perspective is going to be different than your perspective. I believe that there has actually been the research, there's been the data gathering, there's been those things to really try to make the best decisions, and it has to go quickly. We elected a president to act quickly, and that's what he's doing.
Well, I think then if there's information that's been studied or there's research that's been done, it needs to probably be stated again in public, because I'm not hearing too much about it right now. What I'm hearing is just decisions being made in a sense that almost seem to be almost overnight for the sake of efficiency. Now, I happen to agree with you on this, that to me, it is a scandal that our budget is so unbalanced. It's not good for our country. I even think our unbalanced budget is bad for the world and the world's economy. I think it needs to be straightened. I think it has imbalance leads to imbalance in many other ways. So we happen to agree on the sense of balance, and that we do need to work for greater efficiency, but not in a way that is reckless. Because then, for one thing that we see in this decision-making process is that decisions are put forth and then they're pulled back. And there are other institutions around our nation that are not government-related that react to that, like the business community, who want a sense of stability as the markets go. The markets always look for that, I think. But when you make decisions forward and then you pull them back, like in tariffs or in other things like that, it leads to an instability, I think, that is not productive.
I want to give Stan Richard a chance to jump in.
Well, I'm going to bring it more from a historical perspective here, because I've been involved with it, both on the civilian side and the military side. Now, back in the 70s, when they started doing the downsizing after Vietnam, I wound up at a fair and made connection with the National Guard, and they said, have you got prior service? And I told them, yeah. I said, so how would you like to join the National Guard? And I found out that they were at 55% strength. Mm-hmm. And that's only 3 years after Vietnam. Things went quickly. Fast forward to the 90s. And what you got too is the Clinton downsizing, which started with George H.W. Mm-hmm. But he continued on with it, and by 1999 or 2000, we were down 477,000 people. And I was sitting on pins and needles the first 2 years I got hired on in civil service, because that's probationary period. No guarantees that you're going to maintain a job with the government. When the government does a reduction in force, that's what's going to happen. It doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter what your performance is. If you've got less than 3 years in, you could be subject to being laid off. And I've seen it happen. I fortunately managed to weather through it during my first 2 years, and then into the third year. I have to complete 3 years. And once I got to that 3-year mark, everything changed. So that's what you have to look at too. What I didn't hear, except once, I think I heard somebody on the news somewhere said that they were eliminating a lot of people who were in the probationary status, and that's the first year. Second year is career conditional, and then you have career status. Once you hit career status, you're pretty good. Now, from a military perspective, when they did reduction in force, yeah, I was on the hot seat too. How does my evaluations measure up to everybody else's evaluations? And all they need is one little discriminator to keep you from progressing on. All you need is one, and you can be gone. So that part of it. Now, another history lesson has to do with what about this thing about creating or eliminating departments. And back in the Stone Age, when I was first in school, President Eisenhower created something called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. That was the only cabinet post that was not in the line of succession to the presidency. But it was created, and the only thing that would have kept him from creating it would have been a legislative veto. Now, they still have legislative vetoes, but when the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, there was the creation of the EPA, which took over some of their duties. Well, then you don't need all those people in health, education, and welfare. 1979 is when there was the separation of the education department from health, education, and welfare, and then the rest of it became health and human services. So, but that didn't require a veto either, because then again in 1983, the Supreme Court's decision declared that legislative vetoes for this particular purpose were unconstitutional. But I haven't found any indication that that has changed any. So reduction in force is exactly what it is. You reduce force. The thing about the Democrats, they like big government. They're going to bloat the government, where the Republicans are just the opposite. And that's what you're going to find.
Well, one thing I might add, just a couple of things I want to, if this Department of Education was created in 1980, is that correct?
Correct.
79.
79?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it actually came into being just a couple months.
Okay, so
yeah.
80 is under Ronald Reagan.
No, it's still under.
It's at the beginning of Ronald
But
Reagan.
1980 was Ronald Reagan.
No.
No, he was
Okay.
elected in
Right.
1980.
He's elected.
That's what I mean. He was elected. So my point is that one thing I'm not a big fan of many Republicans, but I do quote Ronald
We hear
Reagan
that.
often. And the one quote I quote often of Ronald Reagan is trust, but verify. And there's no verification of these claims that are being made by the administration. There's no verification of these numbers that are bloat. The charges, claims, but no verification.
Well, how do you know that?
Yeah.
Let me finish. I don't know, and you don't either.
No, we don't.
So we don't have public verification of their claims. Secondly, you mentioned that 51% of the population voted for Trump. That's not true. 51% of those that voted for Trump. But the majority of the registered voters did not vote for Donald Trump. So to say that the majority of American public voted for him, that's not, are in favor of this is not true.
But you could actually say that about every election, right?
I'm just verifying what you said.
I said the majority of Americans. Now, if you want to add the majority
of those that voted, but the majority of Americans did not. There's over 81 million that were registered to vote that did not vote at all. So to say that, to imply that the American public, that they generally give a broad brush claim to, is not in support of this. He's created unemployment on a mass scale. The federal government is the largest employer in the nation. He's created unemployment on a mass scale that's creating ripple throughout the nation and around the world. And God is not the author of confusion. He's created a kind of confusion that has rippled not only in the nation, but around the world. And the one thing that the stock markets don't like is instability. I mean, this is a pipe. You cut and you add them back. You cut, you add them back. So it lacks wisdom. It indicates he did not think it through, has not given really thoughtful reflection on what would be the outcome of these rash, chaotic decisions. So it's a very troubling time, and for this woman to come in and say you trust her word, she has no evidence, long track record of trustworthy deliberation in the area of education. She has no experience in that area at all whatsoever.
We could say the same about Carter.
Yeah, but I'm saying this woman, you have no reason to trust her word. Her word is not verifiable enough to believe that what she is saying is in the best interest of this nation education. We need more education, not less. We need a greater educated electorate, not less. And I think it's opening the door, I guess, for privatization, which appears to be the trend that's going on now. So it's a very troubling, chaotic time, and you see it happening across the country, is sweeping the country like a plague. And it's just a very troubling, destabilizing environment that has been ushered in by this new administration.
But isn't part of the issue here of looking at, we call it the Department of Education, but the majority of the expenditures of the Department of Education are grants and aid and administrative costs. They're not really dollars that are going to the primary and secondary schools. They're going to colleges and universities, they're going to grants, they're going to scholarships, they're going to financial aid. The Department of Education, I read a study that said that they provide 90% of the have-tos and 10% of the funding, right? And so the Department of Education, we have to ask, what exactly do they do? And what I see, again, I'm going to trust that we have people who, they have been verified, they have been examined by our representatives, by Congress, and there reaches a point where we have to say, I have to trust. We had to do that with President Biden. We've had to do that with President Obama. We've had to do that with now President Trump again. You know, we're not going to get all of the information, all of the data, all the statistics, because we have elected people to make those decisions for us, right? as ministry leaders, when we make decisions in our churches, not everybody is a part of every decision that we make, and we don't provide all the detailed information to everybody that is in our care, but they have to trust that our leaders of our churches and synagogues are making these decisions. I want to choose to do that like you did with President Biden. I want to choose to do that with President Trump.
Well, I didn't do it with Biden. But I'm saying that the facts of the matter is that the national debt was increased under Republican administrations. It increased under Trump first administration. It went up. Okay? The last time we had a surplus was under Bill Clinton. The debt was reduced under Biden. And they project it will increase again under Trump. So the national debt increases mathematically and consistently under Republican administration, including the previous administration of Donald Trump. So there's no reason to believe that it's going to be decreased now, because you know a tree by the fruit it bears. The fruit is that it increased under his administration, and it appears to be going in the same direction now.
It's increased in everybody's administration. We don't get to $35 trillion from one administration, right?
It didn't increase under Clinton. It didn't increase under Biden.
Drop 477K people, you're going to have a surplus.
Okay. So, but my point is that that so-called debt reduction ideal, does not occur in a Republican administration. That's a fact. So that case is a moot point.
I'd like to see
with
the facts.
Republican administrations.
Where we are now, the administration says that we're going to downsize the Department of Education, and we're going to turn their responsibilities over to the states to deal with. My question is the Commonwealth of Kentucky ready to deal with this? Is the state of Indiana ready to deal with this? Are the 50 United States of America ready to deal with these changes? I fear not. And once again, I see question marks and chaos and no resolution to help educate the children of this country. That's the bottom line. We want to educate the children of this country, and incidentally, we want to educate the people who are in higher education, be it colleges, universities, or vocational situations. That's the bottom line. That's what we need to do, and we need to figure out how to do it the best way possible so that we will not be God forbid, the 40th in the world in certain areas of education.
And the state of Kentucky typically is around the bottom, 49th, 48th at the bottom. And Kentucky is a welfare state. We get more money from the federal government than we pay into it. So to expect the state of Kentucky to be able to handle this load without federal assistance is preposterous.
You know, I think these are difficult calls when we think about the fact that, we spend more in the United States per pupil than any other country, and yet we are ranked so low in our education. I agree with you. I want to do what we can to improve the educational level. Reading, writing, arithmetic, the basics of education, not all the other stuff that gets added on to that's imposed upon them by a bureaucratic mess. I want us to be a country that truly educates our students, and that's not happening, and the Department of Education is not the one who is doing that. That really should be a state and local place, because state and local places know state and local people, right? So we should know how to educate our people. Is it going to be difficult for the states? Yes. But again, I want to trust that in those programs that are doing what they're truly intended to do to increase the educational level of our students, that those will be continued.
You use the word trust. We see this, you're referring to trust with respect to this administration. This administration is not trustworthy.
The prior one was?
This admin, we have a 34 count criminal leading this whole administration, first time in history. So to say you trust him, he's not trustworthy.
But
he has proven to be a non-trustworthy individual perennially in areas of business, the failures of his businesses, failures of his court convictions. So he's not a trustworthy individual. So he is not trustworthy. So if anyone needs to be regulated and to be inspected with public scrutiny, it needs to be this administration. So you can't just throw something out there and expect it to be digested without some scrutiny and verification.
But again, and I want to be careful, I'm sorry if I feel like I'm talking a lot this time, but I think one of the things, when we make these claims and these sayings about the current administration, again, we can look at the prior one that preemptively...
No, I'm just talking about he's a first-time felon. We never had a felon.
But the prior president preemptively pardoned his entire family. Why did that happen?
Well, he's a convicted felon. We've never had that.
Right, but it's also under process of being appealed. So again, I think for us to make these declarative statements is not really helpful.
Back to the education theme, one of the principles of Catholic social teaching is a principle of subsidiarity, which means that problems are best taken care of at the local level. It has some correctives too in other principles of Catholic social teaching. Considering this, one of the things that we know about education in the United States as a whole is that people's opportunity for education is going to be different at different locations. That probably was something that the Department of Education tried to act as an equalizer for. And if those places are eliminated, I think a moral place that we're going to be is that we're going to have to find some way where people throughout the United States have equal opportunity to education, because it can be so radically different from one part of the United States to another. And if the funding is different, or if something is different that way, okay, but we're going to have to find a way where opportunities are just throughout the United States for the sake of education, however that may be. Because it could be that we're moving to a place where that initiative in education is going to be more locally sourced rather than, say, mandated from Washington.
Well, and it's happening in Louisville, Kentucky. Louisville, JCPS is the largest education department in the state of Kentucky, but it's being trying to be controlled by the bureaucracy in Frankfurt. So Kentucky is a great exhibit on what you just described. So it's best to be managed by the local authority than to have it imposed by the authority outside. So that could be applied in Kentucky in a very direct way.
I think you all covered it all. Great discussion. Rarely do we have a topic that goes the full 29 minutes, but we did today. And I can't let this episode pass without just saying our prayers, love, and support to the Bridgman family, an icon of this community. And that was on our topic to discuss today, and I'm sure the clergy here would have had great things to say, as everyone else has said this week about Junior Bridgman. He'll truly be missed in the Louisville and around the world and our nation. So thanks to our panel this week, Reverend Clay Calloway, West Louisville Ministers Coalition, Father John Stoltz, St. Aloysius Catholic Church, Rabbi Stan Miles, the Louisville Melton School, Reverend Dr. George Wasson, Faithpoint Church, and Richard Uhler, retired U.S. Army chaplain. Thanks for watching this week on Moral Side of the News. We'll be back next week with an all-new Moral Side of the News.